In the early winter of 1811, the Mississippi River moved with the steady rhythm it had followed for centuries. Flowing south through forests, farmland, and frontier settlements, the river was the central artery of the young American frontier. Flatboats drifted along its current. Small river towns depended on it for trade, transport, and survival. To the people living along its banks, the Mississippi seemed permanent, vast, powerful, and predictable. But on the night of December 16th, something happened that few who witnessed it would ever forget. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning, the ground beneath the Mississippi Valley began to tremble. At first, it was subtle, the kind of vibration that might be mistaken for distant thunder or the passing of heavy wagons. But within seconds, the shaking intensified. Cabins rattled, trees swayed violently. The earth itself seemed to roll beneath people's feet. Then, something even stranger occurred. Along sections of the Mississippi River, witnesses reported that the water appeared to surge in the opposite direction. Boats were pushed upstream, waves formed where none should exist. To those watching from the riverbanks, it seemed as though one of the largest rivers in the world had suddenly begun to run backwards. More than 2 centuries later, that moment remains one of the most extraordinary natural events ever recorded in American history. To understand how a river could appear to reverse its flow, we have to return to the frontier landscape of early 19th century America and to a series of earthquakes powerful enough to reshape the land itself. In the early 19th century, the central Mississippi Valley was still part of the American frontier. Vast forests stretched across the land, broken only by scattered settlements and trading posts along the river. Much of the region was sparsely populated, with small communities relying on the Mississippi River as their primary connection to the outside world. One of those communities was the town of New Madrid, located in what is now southeastern Missouri. At the time, it was a modest frontier settlement positioned along a bend in the river, a place where traders, farmers, and river travelers occasionally crossed paths. The land surrounding New Madrid appeared stable and quiet. Unlike the mountainous western territories, this region of the United States was not known for earthquakes. The ground seemed firm, the forests dense, and the river steady in its course. But beneath that quiet landscape lay a geological fault system that had remained largely unnoticed. The New Madrid seismic zone runs deep beneath the Mississippi Valley, extending across parts of Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Today, geologists understand that this ancient fault system is capable of producing extremely powerful earthquakes, even though the region sits far from the tectonic plate boundaries typically associated with seismic activity. In 1811, however, none of this was known. To the settlers who lived along the river, the land felt solid and dependable. There were no warning systems, no geological surveys, and no scientific explanation for what was about to happen. When the first powerful earthquake struck in December of that year, it caught the entire region completely unprepared, setting in motion a series of events that would transform the landscape of the Mississippi Valley and leave witnesses struggling to explain what they had seen. And among the many strange reports that followed, one in particular stood out. People claimed the river itself had begun to move in the wrong direction. After the first powerful earthquake struck in December 1811, the shaking did not simply fade away. Instead, the ground continued to tremble again and again. Over the following weeks, the Mississippi Valley experienced hundreds of aftershocks. Some were mild vibrations, barely noticeable to those living in cabins along the river. Others were strong enough to send people running outside into the cold winter air. For many frontier families, the experience was deeply unsettling. The land they depended on, the ground beneath their homes, fields, and forests, no longer felt stable. But the earthquakes did more than shake buildings. They began to reshape the landscape itself. Large sections of earth sank or lifted unexpectedly. Forest floors cracked open. In some places, fissures formed across the land, releasing bursts of sand and water that shot upward from beneath the surface. Along the Mississippi River, travelers and settlers started to report even stranger changes. The powerful tremors triggered landslides along the riverbanks, sending large masses of soil and trees collapsing into the water. These sudden movements displaced enormous volumes of water, creating waves that rolled across the river's surface. Boatmen navigating the Mississippi described violent currents and sudden surges that pushed their vessels in unpredictable directions. In certain stretches of the river, witnesses later reported something almost impossible to explain. For a brief moment, the flow of the Mississippi appeared to reverse. Instead of moving steadily south toward the Gulf of Mexico, the water seemed to surge upstream, as if the river itself had been pushed backward. Whether caused by seismic waves, massive landslides, or temporary changes in the river's channel, the phenomenon left those who saw it struggling to understand what had happened. And the earthquakes were far from over. As the winter of 1811 turned into early 1812, the earthquakes did not fade into memory. Instead, they intensified. The Mississippi Valley continued to shake with a persistence that few people living along the frontier had ever experienced. Tremors arrived without warning, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes during the quiet hours of the afternoon. Each new shock renewed the same unsettling realization: the land itself could no longer be trusted. By January, entire stretches of the region were beginning to show visible signs of transformation. Riverbanks collapsed into the water, forests tilted as sections of earth slowly shifted beneath them. In low-lying areas, the ground sank enough for water to flood the land, creating new wetlands where forests had once stood. Travel along the Mississippi became increasingly dangerous. Boatmen reported sudden waves and violent disturbances on the river's surface. In some places, trees and debris from collapsing banks drifted into the main channel, creating obstacles for vessels moving through the current. The most dramatic moment came in February of 1812, when another massive earthquake struck the region. Witnesses described the ground rising and falling in slow, rolling waves. Entire sections of the landscape seemed to ripple, as if the earth had briefly become liquid. Along parts of the Mississippi River, the shaking triggered enormous displacements of water. Waves surged through the channel with unusual force. For a short but unforgettable moment, observers claimed the river itself appeared to reverse direction again, sending powerful surges of water upstream. The Mississippi had not truly changed its course, but the forces unleashed beneath the earth had become strong enough to make it appear as though one of the largest rivers in the world had lost its sense of direction. And the landscape of the Mississippi Valley would never look the same again. The most powerful moment of the entire earthquake sequence arrived on February 7, 1812. By that point, the people living along the Mississippi Valley had already endured weeks of tremors, but nothing had prepared them for the violence of what would come next. Before dawn, the ground began shaking once again, far more intensely than before. Witnesses later described the motion as rolling waves passing through the earth. Cabins swayed violently, chimneys collapsed, trees bent and snapped as the soil beneath them shifted. Across the region, people rushed outside into the cold darkness, unsure whether their homes would still be standing when the shaking stopped. But the most dramatic changes were happening along the river itself. Sections of the Mississippi's banks collapsed into the water, sending massive amounts of earth and vegetation crashing into the channel. In some places, the ground sank low enough for water to rush inland, flooding forests and farmland. At the same time, powerful seismic forces pushed enormous volumes of water upward through the river system. Boatmen navigating the Mississippi later reported that waves surged unexpectedly through the channel. The river, which normally flowed steadily southward toward the Gulf of Mexico, appeared for brief moments to surge violently in the opposite direction. Some witnesses described boats being forced upstream by sudden walls of water. Others reported whirlpools forming where the current had suddenly been disrupted. The phenomenon did not last long. Within minutes, the Mississippi returned to its normal flow. But for those who witnessed it, the experience was unforgettable, a moment when the familiar laws of nature seemed to briefly fall apart. And even after the shaking stopped, the consequences of those earthquakes continued to reshape the land for years to come. When the earthquakes finally subsided in the months that followed, The Mississippi Valley was no longer the same landscape that settlers had known before the winter of 1811. Across hundreds of miles, the land itself had been reshaped. Large sections of forest had sunk below the waterline, leaving behind what locals began to call sunken lands. In other places, the ground had risen unexpectedly, altering the natural flow of streams and river channels. One of the most remarkable changes occurred in what is now northeastern Arkansas and southeastern Missouri. There, a vast depression created by the earthquakes gradually filled with water from the surrounding rivers. Over time, it formed what is known today as Reelfoot Lake, a body of water that did not exist before the earthquakes. Even decades later, travelers in the region could still see the marks left by the disaster. Forests stood partially submerged in shallow water. Tree trunks tilted at strange angles where the ground beneath them had shifted. Entire sections of land had been transformed into wetlands. For the communities scattered along the Mississippi River, the earthquakes became part of local memory, stories passed down through generations about the winter when the earth would not stop shaking. Although scientific understanding of earthquakes was still limited at the time, later geological studies confirmed that the New Madrid earthquake sequence was among the most powerful ever recorded in North America. Yet perhaps the most enduring image remained the one that witnesses struggled to describe. For a brief moment, during one of the most violent earthquakes, it seemed as though the Mississippi River itself had turned around and begun to run backwards. Today, the Mississippi River continues its long journey southward through the heart of the United States. Cargo ships move along the same waters, towns and cities line its banks. For most people, the river appears constant, a permanent feature of the American landscape. But beneath the surface of the Mississippi Valley, the geological forces that shaped the earthquakes of 1811 and 1812 still exist. Scientists now monitor the region known as the New Madrid seismic zone, aware that the same fault system that shook the frontier more than 2 centuries ago remains active deep beneath the earth. For those who witnessed the earthquakes, the experience must have felt almost impossible to explain. The ground moved like waves, forests sank into water, and for a moment, one of the largest rivers on the continent appeared to run in the wrong direction. It was a reminder that even the most familiar landscapes can change suddenly, and that nature often operates on timescales far larger than a single generation. Stories like this remain scattered throughout American history. If you enjoy exploring these lesser-known moments, the quiet events that shaped places, communities, and landscapes, consider subscribing to Unseen America, because sometimes the most fascinating stories are not the ones everyone remembers. They are the ones history almost forgot.